I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Before we begin this edition of the program, I'd like to remind you that you can support my work on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. It is you, the listener, that helps to make this show possible. I only have one other sponsor. Otherwise, it is you that sponsors this show and makes it possible. So, with that being said, head on over to patreon.com/parallaxviews. Again, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews, and if you can, send me a few bucks. Also, check out my sponsor, Mike Swanson of wallstreetwindow.com. wallstreetwindow.com offers a great straight-shooting financial and trading newsletter. I've had listeners tell me that they've made return on investment from Mike's trading tips. So head on over to wallstreetwindow.com, where you can subscribe to the newsletter and receive Mike's free ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. With that out of the way, on this edition of the program, we welcome back to the show Dr. Annelle Sheline of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, also a former State Department official who famously resigned over the Biden administration's handling of Gaza. Annelle and I will be talking about the peace talks between Israel and Hamas and why she is skeptical about these talks, or at least believes that these talks may be a facade. Find out why in the conversation to follow. With that being said, let's get right to it with Dr. Annelle Sheline. Welcome back to Parallax Views, one of my favorite guests. I always love speaking with her. I think she's a very principled and thoughtful voice, especially on the Middle East and Gaza. Dr. Annelle Sheline is a research fellow in the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute, and she previously served as a foreign affairs officer at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor's Office of Near Eastern Affairs before resigning in March 2024 in protest over the Biden administration's unconditional support for Israeli military operations in Gaza. And we're going to be talking about the talks happening right now in Egypt, the negotiations between Hamas and Israel. I guess, where should we start? Because I'm having a bit of trouble unpacking all of this.
That it's I would say probably the best place to start is to point out that the talks in Sharm el-Sheikh are largely a distraction, similar to how the United States has continually used the facade of pretending to facilitate a so-called peace process in order to enable Israel to continue its policies, whether it was during the Oslo process that then allowed Israel to expand illegal settlements in the West Bank with no repercussions, to now allowing Israel to continue its genocide. This is merely intended to reduce pressure on Israel, which had been gathering And you see that manifested, for example, in the fact that European countries, where you had massive protests and continue to have massive protests opposing genocide, all of the talk, as a result of this public pressure, you had European leaders saying things like, we might boycott Eurovision if Israel participates. We may, pull out of sporting competitions if Israel participates, and or reconsidering the trade relations. Israel, the EU is Israel's most important trading partner. And so all of that is now on hold because the governments say we don't want to endanger these negotiations or the possibility of a ceasefire. So it's completely letting kind of removing the pressure that had been building and demanding actual accountability and an end to countries' complicity in Israel's occupation and genocide. And instead, now, everybody's watching the ins and outs of what's happening in Sharm el-Sheikh. Has Ron Dermer gotten there yet or not? Just all of this is irrelevant when what we should be focusing on is Israel's ongoing genocide, which it is going to continue to do, even if by some, which I don't anticipate will happen. I think that this latest round of ceasefire negotiations is just going to result in the same lack of an outcome as all the other ones have. However, even if this one does finally result in some kind of negotiated ceasefire, Israel is just going to violate it at will, whether it's in, a few days, a few weeks. The January ceasefire lasted for 2 months. Um, Israel's project is to annihilate the population of Palestinians in Gaza, and they are going to continue to do that. And the U.S., unfortunately, continues to be invested in allowing them and enabling them to do that. So this Trump deal is all just an effort to take away some of that pressure.
I was going to say, in that regard, is it even worth me asking you about this, I guess, 20-point plan? It started out as a 21-point plan that I guess Trump has said is getting everything solved in the Middle East. And I get the impression that that's more than just an over-exaggeration. It actually raises more questions than it answers, this 20-point plan.
I mean, the plan itself, so as you said, is it worth even expending the breath to discuss it? But perhaps it is worth discussing because it is so horrible, to things like putting Tony Blair in charge of, or letting him have anything. I mean, Trump is the one, the chairman of the board, but ha Tony Blair to have a role in this. And, so part of why Blair is so objectionable. So obviously, it's not only that he was the architect of Britain's involvement in the Iraq War, in the illegal U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. He was often described as Bush's poodle, just willing to go along with whatever George Bush wanted. Um, but he's on the Zionist payroll. So Larry Ellison, the rich, often the richest man in the world, one of the he who just bought TikTok in order to prevent it from continuing to show the horrors of what's happening in Gaza that have contributed to the fact that Israel has totally lost the narrative. And so now, because they've lost the narrative, now they just want to censor the information instead of trying to convince people. Although they're also still paying people $7,000 a post to post nice things about Israel and Zionism. But Ellison invested 130 million in the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change between 2021 and 2023 and has pledged more than $200 million since then. And at the same time, after meeting Blair, while Blair was the Prime Minister of the UK, Ellison's company called Oracle has been contracted hundreds of times by the British government and earned nearly 1.5 billion in public sector revenue since 2022. So just the level of corruption here. And again, Larry Ellison is someone who's invested hugely in the IDF. I mean, he is the biggest, one of the wealthiest and most powerful proponents of Zionism and Israel's genocide, he's handpicked Tony Blair for this job because of the fact that Blair is bought and paid for by Ellison and by the Zionist agenda. So
Real quick, I was going to say, not to interrupt you, but it's also telling to me that it's Tony Blair. It's not going to be like, why not have a Palestinian
right,
be part of this interim governor position they want to have?
exactly. Like no Palestinians were even invited to review the plan, to work on the plan. Trump was talking a lot about the fact that the, nine Arab and Muslim majority governments were supportive of it. And as you pointed out, they were supportive of an earlier version of the plan, which included things like no annexation of the West Bank, which the current plan doesn't even mention the West Bank. And was clearer on establishing a state of Palestine as the end result of this. I mean, this is what Arab countries have long maintained is their position. Um, the like the fact that these countries were willing to sign on to this, I think just is reflective of the extent to which the United States has, essentially owns these countries, or, these countries depend so heavily on the United States for their security. And the US has pursued a strategy of dominating the Middle East and being the most important purveyor of weapons, the largest security partner, such that these these authoritarian rulers in the Middle East owe their security and their continued rule to the United States. So, of course, they're going to sign on to whatever the United States wants, despite the fact that their own populations are demanding that they do more to stop the genocide. Um, but 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 exactly, like it's just so ludicrous that someone like Tony Blair or anyone, any British or American or non-Palestinian person would be set up as like the viceroy of this, just the latest round of occupation, except that it wouldn't be Israel occupying Gaza. It would now be the United States and Britain taking responsibility for this occupation. Like in what world could any America First Trumpian voter see this as in America's interest to take this on?
I was also curious. Everyone is saying now, well, the plan is saying that no one will be forced to leave Gaza, and those who wish to leave will be free to do so. But is there really any reason to believe that that will be actually held to?
Right. No, there's no reason to believe that. People have mentioned that, I think because it is different than when Trump was talking about the Gaza Riviera and had signed off on just the full ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, that there would be no Palestinians left in Gaza. I think people saw the fact that there were at least words on a page saying that Palestinians would not be forced to leave, or if they did, they would be allowed to return. But right, like why would Palestinians trust that? They were told that they could return in 1948 and they were never allowed to return. Um, so, the maddening thing you hear so often from people, why don't other countries take in Palestinians? Well, that's not the question. The question is, why is Israel allowed to murder Palestinians en masse? That is the question, not, well, Egypt should take them, well, Jordan should take them. No, Israel should not be allowed to just create conditions whereby they're they are, Gaza is no longer livable. And also they shouldn't have all been displaced to Gaza in the first place. The creation of the state of Israel, just this just goes back so far. And today is October 7th, and obviously there's a lot of emphasis on the events of this day 2 years ago. But it's just so maddening because this goes back decades, almost 100 years, and further.
I was going to say, with regards to October 7th, and I just wanted your thoughts on this. I mean, from even from the Israeli perspective, I look at this and would think, well, what has been accomplished in 2 years other than just the massive death of Palestinians? I mean, I mean, those hostages still haven't been returned. And so the strategy hasn't really worked, and there's been all these basically side quests of like, oh, now we're going to do this in Syria, now we're going to do this in Iran, and what has actually been accomplished? Those hostages haven't been returned.
I mean, unfortunately, this just demonstrates that the they are operating under a genocidal logic, whereby the point is to murder Palestinians, murder as many as it takes to get the rest of them to leave, such that Israel can then control the land. And after they're done with Gaza, they're going to do the same to the West Bank. They're already doing the same in the West Bank. Um, so, when you have Israelis that continue to support this. Like, at this point, I think poll numbers are a majority of Israelis just want the hostages to come home. They don't care if there's a ceasefire. They just want the hostages home. But also, a majority of Israelis still support this policy of mass starvation and genocide in Gaza. They are not bothered by it. And so, if as is likely to happen, if Netanyahu agrees, gets the hostages out, and then goes right back to bombing, that's what the majority of Israelis continue to support. And so I think, your question of what has Israel accomplished, they're accomplishing genocide, which is their objective. And again, this remains broadly popular inside of Israel. So when you have American politicians that try to say, "Oh, the problem is Benjamin Netanyahu," or like Tom Friedman saying, it's really all about Netanyahu. No, Israeli society has been fed this radicalized extremism. And it's so maddening because there's always such an emphasis on, Palestinians have to be de-radicalized and Palestinian textbooks are the problem. And it's like, well, what about Israeli textbooks? What about this messaging that treats, that Israeli Jews are taught that essentially all Arabs, but in particular the Arabs, they don't like to say Palestinians, but that they should just be killed. Like that's how you get to peace. And so that explains also the attacks on Syria, on Iran, on Lebanon, on Yemen, on Tunisia, on Qatar, on Iraq, and because they see they've been taught that their security lies in total dominance and subjugation of the people around them. And because the United States continues to provide this unconditional support no matter what they do, that lesson has only been further reinforced.
It's interesting that you mentioned the sort of extreme ideas coming out of Israel. I was talking yesterday to the Israeli dissident Ori Goldberg, and he sort of lamented the fact that, Israel and its body politics has been sort of Alex Jonesified at this point. Everything is just, oh, everything's a Qatari psyop. It's all a psyop by the Iranians and the Qataris to make you talk about dead Gazan babies. And now we're seeing that seep into the American discourse. We just saw that with Van Jones, Thomas Friedman, and Bill Maher. And it's like a version of. I mean, it mirrors like actual anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, like the protocols, but now they're doing it to Qataris and Iranians. Everything's just like a woke Muslim conspiracy. I mean, it's bizarre to see this level of sort of grand conspiracy narrative thrown around by people who are supposed to be considered serious folk.
Well, Ori Goldberg is a hero, and I so admire the ways that he tries to stand up to that, very, very much respect and appreciate Ori. But yeah, and I remember, that this narrative, as you said, is also fairly prevalent in the US, this idea. I mean, I remember, as of a year and a half ago when the protest movement, was really getting going on college campuses and people saying like, well, it's just like Iranian propaganda. And it's like, why does that make more sense than just American young people are repulsed by the mass murder of innocent people and children? Like, doesn't doesn't that make more sense? Like, you think it has to come from like Iran is manipulating us? Like, no, clearly what's happening here is Americans, a majority of Americans, oppose genocide and certainly don't want to pay for it. Um, and and right, I mean, like the I think the Van Jones thing was both horrifying, but also the backlash that he has gotten, I do think just shows that while it was once acceptable to make a dead Palestinian baby the butt of a joke, and in that, I mean, what's horrifying is in that room at that moment, the audience laughed, and that so that it but the reaction he's gotten subsequently from much of the rest of the country, or from um certainly the online space, has made clear that that is not acceptable. And so hopefully that is moving the needle, and such that someone trying who thinks that kind of the dehumanization of Palestinians, and to turn their suffering into a punchline, would understand that that is no longer acceptable.
I hope it made sense what I was saying too when I was saying it, to me it's like a it's just as racist to say, oh, all of this is an evil Islamist plot to brainwash our children, as it would be like to say, oh, all Jews are responsible for what Israel does. It's the same type of dynamic at play, and these conspiracy theories are just removed from reality.
Certainly. I mean, and I'll sort of use that to talk about the fact that
I
you
was going to say too, it's also extremely racist, all of this, but yeah, go
right.
on.
Right. I mean, it is all extremely racist. In particular, I think the way, and so one thing I've been thinking a lot about recently is the fact that that we never had to face any sort of accountability for what the United States did after 9/11, like the global war on terror, the millions of people that the United States killed in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere around the Middle East, the lives destroyed, war crimes committed that were, for which people there was some accountability, but not enough. And instead of anyone ever really having to pay for that, for the fact that the US invaded Iraq on false pretenses, that even just like the idea that Afghanistan as a whole would be held responsible for the fact that bin Laden was there. I mean, that also is insane from just like a legal perspective. But there was never accountability for that. And now we're seeing, so not only has Israel run with that logic and sort of this idea that it's not about, so like in the laws of war, you are permitted to do certain things on a battlefield, and you're not permitted to do other things. And, you have to treat prisoners of war a certain way. You're not supposed to target civilians or civilian infrastructure. But then when you have law change in the way that it was changed by the Bush administration and the Obama administration after 9/11, such that it's no longer about sort of a place where war is happening and how the rules that govern that, but that terrorism, it becomes invested in like a person, like you are a terrorist, and so we have the right to go after you no matter where you are. And the US, Obama did that, killing, with the drone wars, including US citizens in Yemen, including a child, an American child in Yemen. Um, and there was never any pushback to that. Obama didn't come in and say we need to investigate, the George W. Bush administration. We need to try them for war crimes. Um, because Obama expanded a lot of what the Bush administration had done, although they did it differently. Um, and so now this is obviously manifesting in things like the strikes on boats off the coast of Venezuela, where the Trump administration is claiming, that these are drug smugglers and that as a result they are terrorists. I mean, it sounds kind of crazy, but so does this idea that the United States has the right to just hit a terrorist wherever they are in the world, which again is not actually grounded in law, but the US changed the law in order to allow that. And so similarly, Israel is using that kind of logic to say, well, every Palestinian is a terrorist. This is why we have to kill babies because they're going to grow up to be terrorists. I mean, this is a genocidal logic. And and again, there was never, I think after the end of the Bush administration, that was the opportunity because, Obama came in. I mean, I remember that moment, this sense of like, okay, we're gonna like come out of this post 9/11 craziness. And instead of doing that, the Obama administration made different choices. And I think that we still need to do that as a society to come out and push back against the horrifying racism and Islamophobia that has enabled Israel to conduct this genocide on a population to you on this flimsy justification of these are terrorists, we're acting in self-defense, this was our 9/11. Um, and Americans were just sort of primed for, we have to support Israel. They went through such a horrifying experience. And so as a result, like their completely disproportionate reaction, and again, this genocidal logic they have deployed in response and using October 7th as justification for this longstanding project of Zionism and the expulsion of Palestinians. Um, it just, I feel like we wouldn't be here right now if as Americans we had actually insisted that there needed to be accountability for the crimes and the misuse of the law that we accepted after 9/11.
I was going to say not even just with Israel, but I think the global war on terror we're seeing it come home now, even with you don't have to comment on this necessarily, but even with what ICE is doing now, I think
Really?
the war is being brought home, and we're seeing massive domestic repression, and I do think all of this is connected.
Exactly. Exactly. And that it's, the not only going after, people, whether it's Mahmoud Khalil or Rumeysa Ozturk or Badr Khan Suri, like the students who were advocating on behalf of Palestine, or weren't even advocating, honestly. Like the Georgetown postdoc wasn't even really involved in advocacy, and yet he was still locked up. Um, and luckily, so far, we have seen the American legal system reject those efforts to prosecute people for the using their First Amendment rights. Um, but we're not seeing that when it comes to this mass detention of some of whom are not immigrants. I mean, some of these are American citizens. Um, and yeah, it is, I think, just prelude to what else is coming.
I also wanted to ask you, I see a lot of people, and I've even had guests that have made hay out of this. People will say to me, well, the Gulf monarchies no longer see Iran as their biggest threat. They see Israel as being the destabilizing force. And I also see people making hay of this reporting from Axios that Trump was frustrated with Netanyahu in recent talks and basically said, well, why can't you just take the win? Why are you always so negative? I see a lot of people making a big deal out of this, but as someone who was inside the State Department, I'm wondering what you make of these bits of reporting that claim the tide is turning, because I remember when Biden was in office, people were saying, "Oh, Biden, this is the last straw. He's fed up with Netanyahu," but then nothing would change.
Totally. Yeah. And Axios and Barack Ravid have long been the biggest source, I think, of that kind of reporting. Like, oh, Biden/Trump are really frustrated now. He's really gonna read Netanyahu the Riot Act. Um, so yeah, I agree that this is all just part of the charade of our where this what's happening with the negotiations. Are we gonna get a ceasefire? Da da da. When in fact this is all just a distraction and a means for Israel to continue pursuing its agenda. Um, it's just it's it's especially horrifying to think that there are people in Gaza who are desperately hanging on to the hope that the bombs will stop falling, aid will get in. I mean, this is a life and death question for them, and Trump and the American and Biden as well. We're really just doing it as a way to distract us and to reduce the pressure on Israel.
I also mentioned the Gulf states there. Do you think there's any truth to that, or do you think people are making too much of that?
I mean, I do think that the Gulf states are seeing Israel as a more destabilizing actor than
Well,
Iran.
especially with the strike on Doha.
Oh, totally. I mean, that was really shocking for the Qataris and for the other Gulf monarchies. Um, I think that this just deepens a trend that we had already seen, when Saudi Arabia and Iran normalized relations in early 2023. Um, I think that there had been some willingness among the Gulf states to cool down the level of tensions with Iran, and instead to just figure out kind of a modus vivendi. But I don't think that that's necessarily going to translate into these countries then, you know, ending their diplomatic relations with Israel, ending whether it's a normalization agreement like the UAE has or sort of under the table relations like Saudi Arabia has with Israel. Um, they're interested in preserving their own rule. And I think now that the US has offered, big assurances to Qatar that there's no way that'll ever happen again. I don't know if the Qataris believe them. I don't believe them. But I think, the Gulf countries are worried about their own survival and they're not that concerned about Palestinians.
There's just one or two more questions I wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask you about, I see a lot of renewed talk now about the Palestinian Authority and how they will come into play in Gaza. And I think what gets left out in a lot of the mainstream coverage, and you can correct me if you think I'm off base about this, but a lot of Palestinians, I think, have the view that the Palestinian Authority is hopelessly corrupt and even a collaborator. So I don't know how the Palestinian Authority will have legitimacy with Palestinians. And this just seems like it's an ignored point in all of the discourse around the PA.
No, you're certainly right. I mean, the Palestinian Authority has since Oslo operated as kind of the direct um, security guarantor in the West Bank on Israel's behalf. So instead of Israelis, I mean, certainly there's also the presence of Israelis in the West Bank, Israel, the IDF, but also the Palestinian Authority locking people up, implementing the various mechanisms of Israeli occupation. And you're right, they are totally delegitimized, and Abbas is seen as hopelessly corrupt, as you said, and also just solely preoccupied with his own power, even though he's extremely old. And I think a lot of people are probably just hoping that mortality will eventually allow for some kind of shakeup in the Palestinian Authority. Excuse me. So the question then is, why does Israel continue to see the PA as such a threat? They've insisted they don't want any role for the PA in any sort of future governance. They don't want, I was at Israel's request that the US disinvited PA officials from attending the UN General Assembly. My understanding is that's because the Palestinian Authority was supposed to be this kernel of a state that coming out of Oslo would eventually govern a future state of Palestine. And so from Netanyahu's perspective, he's much more interested in having Hamas be the power, the ostensible power on the other side of the negotiating table, because he can say, look, I'm working with terrorists here, I can't be responsible, to blow up Hamas negotiators is still somehow seen as legitimate, whereas blowing up the Palestinian Authority would be a little bit harder to explain. They have renounced violence, they are not terrorists. But as you said, they're also completely illegitimate in the eyes of their own population, so they don't really pose that much of a threat. But I think it's the idea of any sort of legitimate, any sort of future PA that could be more legitimate. If someone like Marwan Barghouti, for example, were ever to be released, who I doubt will ever be released alive.
For my audience, can you explain why his name comes up so often for people?
So, Marwan Barghouti is someone who, who's a Palestinian held in jail by the Israelis, who has emerged as something like a Nelson Mandela figure. Not unlike Mandela, he was involved in some acts of violence, subsequently renounced violence. But from the Israeli perspective, is a terrorist, but it's similar to how Nelson Mandela was viewed as a terrorist by apartheid South Africa. Um, but it is very much seen as a unifying figure, someone who would have the credibility on the ground to potentially lead some kind of interim government and unify these different Palestinian factions. Um, no one's perfect. Nelson Mandela wasn't perfect. It's sometimes a little frustrating when you hear people talk about, post-apartheid South Africa as a model for kind of this future, like one state, because I mean, post-apartheid South Africa is has so many problems. And again, there's still horrific inequality whereby white South Africans continue to hold on to vast amounts of the resources, even though, they're now being treated as refugees by the Trump administration. Um, so while I hope that, obviously a post-apartheid South Africa is a better set of circumstances than apartheid South Africa, for the majority of South Africans. But I also worry a little bit that some of the ways that the sources of inequality inherent in apartheid were allowed to continue, I think should be a model if there ever is a true move towards a one state reality where you would have equal rights for everyone in historic Palestine.
That's actually going to be a lead into the last thing I wanted to talk with you about, if you have a moment here. First, I wanted to say I'm really actually surprised at the moment we're in with regards to how the public views all of this. Like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, or even when I was in, I was talking about the issue of Palestinians and their plight even in like middle school. Everyone thought I was crazy for it. But now we see like Jon Stewart interviewing Peter Beinart. Um, we see major A-list actors and actresses, most recently Jennifer Lawrence, calling what's happening in Gaza a genocide. Javier Bardem. We have both Republicans and Democrats that are sort of bucking the trend of unconditional support to Israel, whether you're talking about Thomas Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene are figures on the progressive end of the political spectrum. And I do feel like something is changing. And it's interesting, you mentioned the one state solution. And, I've had people that are apolitical say to me, it's almost like Israel already has a one state. Ian Lustig has called it the one state reality. I mean, Israel does control everything from the river to the sea, and they refuse to define their borders. Uh, to which I've brought that point up to, rather apolitical people, and they'll say, then why are we paying to defend Israel? It's not our problem then. It's a policing problem for them if they don't want to define their borders and if they don't want to make a peace. And I think it is getting to the point where Americans are starting to think more about, well, why should the aid be unconditional if they won't define their borders, if they won't do this, if they won't meet this demand, etc. Can you speak to that? Do you think there is a changing of the tide? I hope I wasn't too drawn out in explaining my thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think Israel has lost the narrative, and that's why they're interested in now just gaining control of the various media systems in order to censor the information getting out, whether it's the purchase of TikTok by Larry Ellison, the buyout of CBS, and installation of
Bringing in Barry Weiss. Ugh.
right. I mean, the my colleague Nick Cleveland Stout, who did the reporting on the fact that Israel pays influencers $7,000 a post to say nice things about Israel and Zionism. They've lost the narrative and now they're just trying to to prevent information, and they're systematically murdering journalists inside of Gaza. So we're not seeing as many horrors coming out because there are very few journalists left. Um, so I mean the question of certainly I think a lot of the tide has turned as far as the majority of Americans wondering why on earth do we continue to provide this unconditional, massive amounts of money to Israel, $30 billion over the past 2 years.
I was going to say, even I've seen recent polling of Jewish Americans who are much more divided now on this.
Exactly. Exactly. Um, so I do think that, they've really lost a majority of Americans on this, especially young Americans. And that's part of why Netanyahu and his government, I think, are going as hard as they can now while they still have this unconditional US support. Um, the question of, a one state reality, I mean, a key difference, what Ian Lustig identified is apartheid. Whereas, the idea that a one state reality could actually be a solution would be equal rights for.
Right, yeah, yeah. Well, that's the difference, right? I mean, right now there's a reality where Israel basically controls everything from the river to the sea, and there's no equality. But you could have one democratic state instead of that.
Exactly. And the question is how do we get to that? Right now there's no Israeli politician that's even talking about that. But I think the way we get there is for Israel to realize that it is a pariah state, that other countries are not going to maintain trade relations. They're not going to allow Israelis to travel without having to answer questions about, when was your IDF service, or did you likely commit war crimes during your IDF service? I mean, the big question here is the United States. As long as the U.S. continues to provide this unconditional support, Israel has no incentive to change its behavior.
I know I have to let you get going, but do you have any final thoughts? What do you want my listeners to get out of this particular conversation? I know it's an emotional one for you and myself and others who've been just bearing witness to all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it is significant that we do see really the tide shifting. And I think it is now a question of American politicians changing. And so continuing to call your representatives, supporting things like the Block the Bombs Act, making clear that as an American, you do not want to be represented by someone who continues to vote for more money and more weapons to go to Israel. And that you expect your representatives to no longer support Israel unconditionally. I mean, we as Americans bear such a huge responsibility for this because Israel could not do this without US support.
Thank you so much, Annelle, for coming back on Parallax Views. I always appreciate it, and my listeners do as well.
Thank you so much for having me.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/parallaxviews, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program.
Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.